She thought the divorce was the end of her suffering. But for Ilara, the constant mockery from her ex-husband was a fresh wound that tore open every single day. He laughed at her attempts to rebuild, calling her new dates pity projects and her new life pathetically small. He was so convinced of her failure, so wrapped up in his own arrogance, that he never stopped to wonder who was holding her hand in the quiet moments. He had no idea her new pity project was about to buy the very company he worked for. This is the story of how a woman's quiet strength became a silent roar that shattered one man's world and redefined her own. The Tuesday morning light in Austin, Texas was thin and apologetic, filtering through the blinds of Ilara Vance's small, rented bungalow. It was the kind of light that revealed dust motes dancing in the air and the faint coffee ring on the wooden coaster she'd forgotten to wipe clean. It was a light that exposed things, and Ilara had spent the last 2 years trying to live in the shadows. Her phone buzzed on the granite countertop, a harsh, intrusive sound that made her shoulders tense instinctively. The name on the screen was a ghost from a life she no longer recognized as her own. Mark Jennings. She stared at it, her heart performing the familiar, frantic rhythm it reserved exclusively for him. A part of her, the part that still flinched at loud noises and sudden movements, wanted to hurl the phone against the wall. But there was the matter of the final joint tax return they were still wrangling over, a loose thread he kept pulling just to watch her unravel. With a sigh that felt like it carried the weight of their 10-year marriage, she answered. "Hello, Mark." Her voice was carefully neutral, a grey rock she'd spent months polishing. "Lara," he said, his voice oozing that practiced, condescending charm he used with clients and waitstaff. He never used her full name, Ilara. It was too elegant, too whole. He'd always preferred the shortened, more pliable Lara. "Just calling about the documents from Henderson. Did you get them?" "They came yesterday. I'll sign them and send them back by the end of the day," she said, already moving toward her small home office. "Get it done. Get off the phone." Good, good. No point in dragging these things out. A pause. Ilara knew what was coming next. It was the same cadence, the same conversational feint he always used before the jab. "So I saw you the other night, at that little Italian place, Divino's." Her stomach tightened. She'd been there on Friday, with Julian. It had been their third date, a quiet affair filled with soft laughter and the surprising comfort of easy silence. "Oh?" she said, her voice a little too high. "Yeah, looked like you were having an interesting time." The condescension was gone, replaced by a thick, syrupy amusement. "Another one of your reclamation projects, Lara." He looked a little rumpled, like he'd spent the afternoon wrestling a bear. Ilara's eyes closed. Mark, a senior vice president at a mid-tier tech firm, was a man who lived and died by appearances. His suits were tailored, his shoes were Italian leather, and his disdain for anything less than polished was a weapon. Julian, with his soft, unassuming sweaters, thoughtful eyes, and a comfortable way of inhabiting his own skin, was the antithesis of Mark's brittle perfection. "His name is Julian," she said, her knuckles white as she gripped the edge of the counter, "and he's a lovely man." Mark's laughter crackled through the phone. It was the same laugh he'd used when she'd presented him with a business plan for her own landscaping company, the one he'd called a cute little hobby. It was the same laugh he'd used when she'd cried after her father's funeral, telling her she was being overly dramatic. It was a sound designed to diminish, to shrink her world until it was just big enough for him to stand in the center. "A lovely man," he mimicked. "God, you're so predictable, always going for the wounded birds. What's his story? Fired from his soul-crushing middle management job? Living with his mom? Let me guess, he's an artist." The cruelty was so reflexive, so effortless, that it stole her breath. During their marriage, he had systematically dismantled her confidence, convincing her that her empathy was a weakness, a fatal flaw that made her a target for losers and mediocrities. He'd framed himself as her protector, the one who could see the world for what it was, while she was just a bleeding heart, destined to be taken advantage of. "I have to go, Mark. I have a meeting." A lie, but a necessary one. "Right, a meeting. With a client for your little flower pot business?" He sighed, a theatrical sound of paternal disappointment. "Look, Lara, I'm just saying, you deserve what you settle for, I guess. Just try not to bring him around the old neighborhood. It's embarrassing." The line went dead. Ilara stood in the silence of her kitchen, the echo of his laughter ringing in her ears. Embarrassing, wounded birds, reclamation projects. The words were stones he'd been throwing at her for years, and even now, with the legal ties severed, they still left bruises. She sank onto a stool, her carefully constructed mourning collapsing around her. This was his power. Not physical, never that. It was psychological, a slow, corrosive drip of acid on her soul. He had painted a picture of her as a weak, naive woman who couldn't survive without his brilliant, cynical guidance. The most insidious part of his abuse was that for a long time she had believed him. Her gaze drifted to the single, perfect gardenia floating in a bowl of water on her table. Julian had brought it for her. Not a bouquet, just one flower. "It reminded me of you," he'd said, his voice quiet and sincere. "Elegant and stronger than it looks." Julian Thorne. He'd told her he was in strategic investments, a vague term that she hadn't pressed him on. It didn't matter. What mattered was how he looked at her, as if he were seeing not the broken pieces Mark had left behind, but the person she was trying to become. He listened with an intensity that was almost unnerving, his gaze never wavering. He asked about her passion for landscape design, not her little business, and had spent an hour looking through her portfolio, commenting on her use of native Texas grasses and her eye for color theory. With him, she didn't feel like a project. She felt seen. But Mark's voice was a poison that seeped into everything. Was he right? Was she just repeating a pattern? Julian was quiet, introspective, and there was a sadness in his eyes she recognized because she saw it in her own reflection. Was she drawn to his melancholy, mistaking it for depth? The doubt, Mark's most enduring legacy, crept in, cold and familiar. She pushed it away, straightening her back. She would not let that man, with his hollow laugh and emptier heart, ruin this. She had a business to run, a small but growing enterprise that paid her bills and brought her a quiet, profound joy. And she had a date with Julian on Thursday. They were going to a small gallery to see a photography exhibit. She walked to her desk, picked up a pen, and with a hand that was only shaking slightly, she signed the tax documents. She would put them in the mail, another thread to the past severed. She would focus on the feel of the soil under her fingernails, the satisfaction of a blueprint coming to life, and the possibility that Julian's kindness wasn't a prelude to a punchline, but simply kindness. But as she sealed the envelope, the echo of Mark's laughter remained, a ghost in the sunlit room, daring her to be happy. The art gallery was a cavernous space in a repurposed warehouse on the east side of town. The polished concrete floors reflected the stark, black and white photographs lining the white walls, portraits of weathered faces, sprawling, desolate landscapes, and intimate, unguarded moments. It was the kind of place Mark would have hated, deeming it pretentious and unprofitable. Ilara loved it immediately. Julian stood beside her, his hands tucked into the pockets of his dark grey trousers. He hadn't said much since they'd arrived, but his presence was a warm, grounding force. He moved with a quiet deliberation, studying each photograph not with a critic's eye, but with a genuine, unhurried curiosity. "What do you think?" he finally asked, his voice low, as they stood before a portrait of an elderly woman whose face was a roadmap of wrinkles, her eyes holding a universe of stories. "I think," Ilara began, searching for the right words, "that the photographer didn't just take her picture, he listened to her silence." Julian turned to her, a slow, appreciative smile spreading across his face. It was a smile that reached his eyes, chasing away some of the melancholy she'd seen there before. That's a beautiful way to put it. Listen to her silence. I like that. For the rest of the evening they talked, not just about the art, but about everything and nothing. He asked her about the first garden she ever designed, a small, chaotic patch of wildflowers for her grandmother. She asked him what he did to unwind, and he surprised her by saying he built intricate ship models, a hobby that required immense patience and a steady hand. He spoke of his work in strategic investments with a certain detachment, more interested in the complex problem-solving aspect than any financial outcome. He was an enigma, but a comfortable one. There was an ease between them that felt both brand new and deeply familiar. It was the ease of two people who understood what it was to feel out of place in a loud, aggressive world. With Mark, conversations had been a performance. She was the audience, and he was the star, regaling her with tales of his corporate triumphs, his clever put-downs of his rivals, and his grand pronouncements on politics and culture. Being with Julian was a dialogue, a gentle back and forth, a space where her thoughts were given weight and respect. Later, as he walked her to her car, the cool night air was a welcome relief from the stuffy gallery. "I had a really wonderful time tonight, Julian," she said, meaning it more than she'd meant anything in a long time. "Me too, Ilara." He used her full name, and the way it sounded in his calm, resonant voice made her feel whole. "I was wondering, I know this is forward, but there's a charity gala my company sponsors next weekend. It's for the Hill Country Conservancy. I know you have a passion for native landscapes. I thought you might enjoy it." He looked genuinely hesitant, almost shy. "It's a bit stuffy, a lot of suits. I'd understand if you'd rather not." The mention of suits sent a small, irrational shiver of dread down her spine. It was Mark's world. A world of forced smiles, sharp elbows, and social calculus. A world where she had always felt like an accessory, her dress and her demeanor subject to his approval. But then she looked at Julian. He wasn't asking her to be an accessory. He was inviting her to share in something he thought she would appreciate. The Hill Country Conservancy did incredible work, and the thought of supporting them, even just by attending an event, was appealing. It was a chance to step, just for a night, into a world she'd fled, but on her own terms. With him. "I'd love to," she heard herself say, the words feeling brave and reckless. His relief was palpable. "Great, it's Saturday. I'll send you the details." He didn't lean in for a kiss. Instead, he just touched her arm lightly, his fingers warm on her skin for a brief moment. "Drive safe, Ilara." As she drove home, a giddy, unfamiliar feeling bubbled in her chest. It was hope, she realized, but a fragile, tentative version of it. For the rest of the week, she threw herself into her work, finalizing a design for a drought-resistant garden for a new office complex, and spending hours at a nursery, her hands happily covered in dirt. She felt more herself than she had in years. The peace was shattered on Friday afternoon. She was loading bags of mulch into the back of her truck when her phone buzzed. It was Mark. Again. She ignored it. He called again. She ignored it again. Then came the text message. "Mark, need to talk. It's about the house." Her blood ran cold. The house. The beautiful 4-bedroom craftsman they had bought together, the one she had poured her heart into renovating, the one she had to leave behind because every room screamed with memories of his criticism and her silent tears. They had agreed to sell it, but Mark had been dragging his feet, living there alone, a king in a castle of shared ghosts. She typed back, her fingers stiff. "Ilara, what about it?" "Mark, just call me. It's easier." With a sense of impending doom, she dialed his number. "I got an offer," he said without preamble. "A fantastic one, way over asking." Ilara felt a rush of relief. This was it, the final financial tie, the last shared asset. "That's great, Mark. Send me the paperwork and I'll sign." "Not so fast," he said, and there it was. the familiar, predatory tone. "There's a complication. The buyer wants a quick close, but they also want the garden redone. Apparently your little wildflower experiment isn't their cup of tea. They want something more formal, structured." The insult was so casual, so perfectly aimed. He knew how much that garden, a riot of black-eyed Susans, bluebonnets and purple coneflowers, meant to her. It had been her one act of defiance in a world of manicured lawns and rigid hedges he had insisted upon. "So the buyers can hire a landscaper," she said coolly. "Or," he said, letting the word hang in the air, "you could do it as a favor to ensure the sale goes through smoothly. It would save us both a lot of money and hassle. I told them my ex-wife was a landscaper and could probably whip it into shape in a weekend." The audacity of it was breathtaking. He wanted her to come back to that house, to the site of her deepest unhappiness, and tear up the one thing she had created for herself, to replace it with the very aesthetic she despised, all for his convenience. "No," she said, the word feeling powerful and liberating. "No?" He sounded genuinely shocked, as if the possibility had never occurred to him. "Lara, don't be difficult. This is a 7-figure deal. Don't let your little artistic pride get in the way of a massive payday for both of us." "My little artistic pride is not the issue, Mark. My answer is no. Hire someone else. Take it out of the proceeds. I don't care. But I am not setting foot on that property." He was silent for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was cold, stripped of all its fake charm. "You know, I was starting to think you were getting better, that you were finally moving on with your sad little life. But this is pathetic. You're still so weak you can't even face a garden. He must be a real piece of work, that new guy, if he's making you this fragile." "He has nothing to do with this," she snapped. "Oh, I bet he does. I bet he's one of those sensitive types who encourages you to honor your feelings. You're probably paying for his coffee. Jesus, Lara, when are you going to wake up and realize you need someone who can actually take care of you?" She hung up. Her whole body was trembling, a cocktail of fury and a deeper, more painful sorrow. He still saw her as his broken possession. He couldn't conceive of her making a decision based on her own self-worth, her own well-being. It had to be the influence of another, weaker man. The joy she'd felt about the gala, about her date with Julian, evaporated, replaced by a grey fog of doubt. Maybe Mark was right. Maybe she was weak. The thought of going to a black tie event, of putting on a dress and making small talk, suddenly felt like an insurmountable challenge. She felt exposed, fragile, and deeply, profoundly tired. The whispers of a new beginning were being drowned out by the roar of the past. The dress was emerald green, the color of new leaves after a spring rain. It was a simple, elegant sheath of silk that clung in all the right places and made Ilara feel like a version of herself she hadn't met yet, but wanted to know better. She had bought it in a fit of defiance after the call with Mark, an act of rebellion against the grey fog he had tried to pull over her. Staring at her reflection, she saw not a fragile, broken woman, but someone poised. The doubt was still there, a low hum beneath the surface. But for the first time, another feeling was singing a higher, clearer note: determination. Julian arrived precisely at 7, looking so handsome in a classic black tuxedo that it momentarily took her breath away. He didn't just look like he belonged in it. He looked comfortable, at ease. He held a small box in his hands. "You look breathtaking, Ilara," he said, his eyes filled with a sincere admiration that felt like a balm on her bruised confidence. "You're not so bad yourself, Thorne," she replied, a playful smile touching her lips. I brought you something," he said, his shyness returning as he handed her the box. "It's probably silly, but when I saw it, I thought of you." Inside, nestled on a bed of black velvet, was a delicate silver necklace. The pendant was a tiny, intricately detailed gardenia, its petals perfectly rendered. It was a mirror of the single flower he had given her on their first date. It was the most thoughtful gift she had ever received. "Julian, it's beautiful," she whispered, her throat tight with emotion. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," he smiled gently. "May I?" She turned, lifting her hair as he fastened the delicate chain around her neck. His fingers were warm and steady, and for a fleeting moment she leaned back slightly, absorbing the quiet strength that emanated from him. When she faced him again, the silver gardenia rested in the hollow of her throat, a cool, solid promise. The venue for the gala was the Arista, a sprawling modern hotel downtown with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a glittering panorama of the Austin skyline. The ballroom was a sea of black ties and designer gowns. Champagne flutes clinked, and the low roar of conversation filled the air. It was exactly the kind of scene that used to fill Ilara with a paralyzing anxiety. Tonight, however, was different. With Julian by her side, she felt insulated. He was a calm anchor in the swirling tide of people. He introduced her to a few colleagues, a warm older couple who worked for the Conservancy, and a young, energetic tech innovator. He introduced her simply as my friend Ilara Vance, but the way he said my friend was filled with a gentle possessiveness that made her feel cherished, not owned. He never left her side, keeping a light hand on the small of her back, guiding her through the crowd, and leaning in to whisper a funny observation or a piece of trivia about the architecture. He made her feel included, a partner in the evening rather than a silent spectator. About an hour in, while Julian was getting them fresh glasses of champagne, Ilara stood near one of the large windows, looking out at the city lights. "Well, well, well, look what the cat dragged in." The voice, thick with malice and surprise, cut through the noise of the party. Ilara froze, her entire body going rigid. She didn't have to turn around. She knew that voice better than her own. Mark. She composed herself, taking a slow, deliberate breath before turning to face him. He was standing there with a woman on his arm, a blonde with a dress that was a little too tight and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Mark's own eyes, however, were wide with a kind of predatory glee. He was looking her up and down, his gaze lingering on the simple elegance of her dress, a flicker of something. Was it shock, confusion, in their depths? "Mark," she said, her voice a flat, cool stone. "What are you doing here?" "My company bought a table. Have to network. You know how it is." He gestured dismissively at the opulence around them. "I'm more surprised to see you here. This seems a little above your usual pay grade. Did your sad-eyed artist friend win the lottery?" The insult was so predictable, so quintessentially Mark, that it almost didn't land. Almost. "I'm here as a guest," she said simply, refusing to take the bait. "A guest?" He laughed, the ugly sound she hated so much. "Right. Who'd you manage to sucker into a ticket? Don't tell me it's the guy from the Italian place, the rumpled one. Is he here? I'd love to meet the man who encourages you to throw away perfectly good real estate deals." His date was looking back and forth between them, her plastered smile starting to falter. Ilara could feel the eyes of people nearby starting to turn in their direction. He was making a scene, and he was enjoying it. He was asserting his dominance, reminding her of her place in his world, even if they no longer shared one. The old Ilara would have shrunk, she would have stammered an excuse, flushed with shame, and fled. But as she looked at Mark, at his perfectly tailored suit and his perfectly coiffed hair, she didn't see a powerful man. She saw a bully, a small, insecure man who had to tear others down to feel tall. And she saw the silver gardenia resting against her skin, stronger than it looks. "My date is getting us drinks," she said, her voice steady and clear, carrying easily over the din. "And for the record, Mark, my decisions are my own. They have nothing to do with him, and they certainly have nothing to do with you." It was the first time she had ever spoken to him with such unequivocal finality. A crack appeared in his smug facade. His smile tightened at the corners. He wasn't used to this Ilara. This Ilara wasn't playing her part. Still so defensive, he scoffed, trying to regain control. Some things never change. You're right, she said, and she gave him a small, pitying smile. Some things don't. Just then, Julian returned, 2 champagne flutes in his hands. He stopped short when he saw Mark, his calm demeanor instantly registering the tension in the air. He looked from Mark's sneering face to Ilara's composed one. Everything okay here? He asked, his eyes on Ilara, his voice a low thrum of concern. Mark's gaze slid over to Julian. He took in the well-cut tuxedo, the quiet confidence, the way he stood so naturally beside Ilara. Mark's eyes narrowed, performing a swift, brutal calculus of status and threat. This was not the rumpled, sad-eyed man he had imagined. This was something else, but he still couldn't place him. Just catching up with my ex-wife, Mark said, turning his charm on Julian, extending a hand. Mark Jennings, I don't think we've been introduced. Julian passed a flute to Ilara, his fingers brushing hers before shaking Mark's hand. The handshake was brief, firm. Julian Thorne. The name meant nothing to Mark. It was just a name. He relaxed, his arrogance flooding back in. He'd sized Julian up and found him wanting. Just another handsome face in a rented tux, trying to punch above his weight. Julian Thorne, Mark repeated, a smirk playing on his lips. He turned his attention back to Ilara, his voice dripping with mock sincerity. Well, Lara, you certainly clean up nice, and so does your friend. You two have fun tonight. Don't spend all your money in one place. With a final, dismissive wink, he steered his date away, melting back into the crowd. The confrontation left Ilara trembling, but not with fear. It was adrenaline. For the first time, she hadn't just survived an encounter with Mark. She had won. She hadn't screamed or cried. She had simply stood her ground, calm and resolute. She had refused to be diminished. Are you all right? Julian asked, his voice pulling her back from the brink. She looked at him, at the genuine worry in his eyes, and a wave of gratitude washed over her. I'm fine, she said, and was surprised to find that it was the truth. Better than fine, actually. He didn't press her for details. He simply nodded, his presence a silent statement of support. Good, he said, because I was about to ask you to dance. As he led her to the dance floor, she felt the last of the tension drain away. The ghost of Mark's laughter was still there, but it was fainter now, a distant echo in a room filled with music, and the steady, reassuring beat of a new and better heart. The crack in Mark's facade was nothing compared to the one that had just opened up in the walls she'd built around herself. Through it, light was pouring in. The rest of the evening passed in a haze of quiet joy for Ilara. She danced with Julian. She listened to the speeches about land conservation with genuine interest, and she even found herself engaging in easy conversation with the people at their table. She felt present, whole, and blissfully free from the shadow of her ex-husband. Mark, for his part, kept his distance. Ilara caught his eye once or twice from across the ballroom. He was watching her, his expression a mixture of confusion and irritation, like a scientist observing an experiment that had gone inexplicably wrong. He couldn't understand why his barbs hadn't worked, why she wasn't cowering in a corner. The sight of her laughing with Julian, looking radiant and confident, was a deep, personal affront to the narrative he had constructed about her. The keynote speaker of the evening was a man named Robert Sterling, the chairman of the board for the Hill Country Conservancy and, as the program noted, the recently retired CEO of Sterling Financial Group. He was a distinguished, silver-haired man with a powerful voice and an easy charisma. As he concluded his speech, he raised his glass. And finally, he boomed, I want to extend a personal thank you to the man whose vision and incredible generosity made tonight possible. His company has been our title sponsor for 5 years running, and his personal commitment to preserving the beauty of Texas is truly unmatched. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in a round of applause for the CEO of Thorne Industries, my friend, Mr. Julian Thorne. A spotlight swiveled from the stage and landed directly on their table. Ilara's mind went blank. The entire ballroom erupted in applause, and every head turned towards them, towards Julian. He gave her a small, almost apologetic smile, squeezed her hand under the table, and then rose to his feet. He gave a gracious nod to the room and a warm smile to Robert Sterling, the picture of understated power and humility. Ilara just sat there, frozen, the champagne flute halfway to her lips. Thorn Industries. The name was vaguely familiar, a corporate giant she'd probably seen on the side of a downtown skyscraper or read about in the business section of the paper. A company that dealt in global logistics, technology, and strategic acquisitions. A multi-billion-dollar empire. Julian Thorn. The quiet, introspective man who built model ships and listened to the silence in photographs. The man who wore soft sweaters and brought her single gardenias. That Julian Thorn was the Julian Thorn. A dizzying, vertiginous wave of shock washed over her. It wasn't about the money, not really. It was about the sheer scale of the reality she had just stumbled into. She had been so focused on her own small world, on her own internal battles, that she had never even thought to Google his name. He had told her he was in strategic investments, and in his world, that was the simple, unadorned truth. The CEO of Thorn Industries was, indeed, in strategic investments. As Julian sat back down, the applause fading, he turned to her, his expression searching and a little anxious. "I should have told you," he said, his voice low, meant only for her. "I didn't want it to be a thing between us." "A thing?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "The money, the title, it complicates things. It changes how people see me. I just wanted to be Julian, with you." His sincerity was so plain, so vulnerable, that it cut through her shock. He hadn't been hiding his identity to deceive her. He had been protecting the fragile, authentic connection they were building. He had given her the gift of seeing him without the blinding glare of his wealth, and she suddenly understood how precious that was. And then her gaze was involuntarily drawn across the room. Mark was standing stock still near the bar, his drink forgotten in his hand. His face, usually a mask of smug control, was completely slack with disbelief. His jaw was literally hanging open. His eyes were wide, fixed on Julian, then darting to Ilara, then back to Julian. The confident posture, the arrogant tilt of his head, it had all collapsed. He looked like a man who had just seen the laws of physics bend. He was frantically connecting the dots. The easy way Julian wore his tuxedo. The deference people showed him. The way Robert Sterling, a titan of industry himself, had called him a friend. Thorn Industries. The name was now exploding in Mark's mind like a supernova. He worked in the tech sector. Of course he knew Thorn Industries. They were a predator, a behemoth that swallowed smaller companies like his for breakfast. The mockery, the condescension, the casual cruelty he had directed at Ilara and her rumpled date now looked not just foolish, but cosmically, suicidally stupid. He had mocked a man who could buy and sell him 1,000 times over before he'd even finished his morning coffee. The blood drained from Mark's face, replaced by a mottled, sickly pallor. He looked small, insignificant. All the borrowed power he derived from his title, his suit, his sense of superiority, had been incinerated in an instant by the spotlight that had landed on Julian Thorn. He saw Ilara looking at him, and for a split second their eyes met across the crowded room. In his, she saw not anger, but raw, naked panic. The bully, confronted with a power he couldn't possibly comprehend, had been revealed for what he was, a terrified child. He turned abruptly and practically fled the ballroom, his blonde companion trailing behind him in confused silence. The unveiling was complete. But it wasn't Julian's identity that had truly been revealed. It was Mark's. Ilara turned back to Julian, the noise of the room fading into a distant hum. The shock was receding, replaced by a strange, breathtaking clarity. This wasn't a fairy tale. This wasn't about a poor girl being rescued by a rich prince. This was about a woman who had been learning to stand on her own 2 feet and had discovered, quite by accident, that the kind man holding her hand happened to own the ground beneath them. "Thank you," she said to Julian, her voice regaining its strength. He looked confused. "For what? For not telling you I was ridiculously wealthy?" She laughed, a real, genuine laugh that came from deep in her belly. "No, thank you for wanting to just be Julian." His shoulders relaxed, the anxiety melting from his eyes. He smiled, that slow, wonderful smile that made her feel like the only person in the world. He picked up her hand from the table and laced his fingers through hers, his thumb gently stroking her knuckles. "I'm always going to be just Julian," he said softly, "for you." And in that moment, Ilara knew that the power imbalance Mark had so carefully cultivated for a decade had not just been leveled, it had been annihilated. And she had been the one to light the fuse, not by landing a billionaire, but by simply refusing to be small. The silence in Ilara's bungalow was different now. For 2 years, it had been a space she'd had to consciously fill to keep the ghosts at bay, with music, with podcasts, with the hum of the television. Now, the quiet felt peaceful, earned. It was a silence that belonged to her. It had been 3 days since the gala. 3 days since Mark had vanished from the ballroom like a startled phantom. He hadn't called. He hadn't texted. This absence of harassment was more telling than any angry tirade could have been. It was the silence of a man completely and utterly checkmated, his king toppled, his board swept clean. Ilara had spent the weekend with Julian. Not at a fancy restaurant or a high society event, but in her own backyard, their hands in the dirt as he helped her build a new raised bed for a vegetable garden. He'd shown up in old jeans and a faded University of Texas t-shirt, looking nothing like a CEO and everything like the kind, grounded man she was falling for. They'd talked about the revelation at the gala. She'd explained her history with Mark, not in excruciating detail, but enough for him to understand the landscape of her past, the constant erosion of her self-worth, the psychological warfare. He listened, as he always did, with quiet, unwavering attention. He didn't offer solutions or platitudes. He didn't say, "I'll take care of him." He just listened, and when she was done, he'd taken her soil-streaked hand in his and said, "His opinion of you is a reflection of him, not you. I hope you know that." And she did. Now she finally truly did. On Wednesday morning, as Ilara was sketching a new planting design, her phone rang. It was an unknown number. She hesitated, then answered. "Lara?" The voice was unrecognizable at first. It was thin, reedy, stripped of its usual bravado. It was Mark. "Hello, Mark," she said, her own voice calm, betraying none of the surprise she felt. "Hi, I know I haven't called." He sounded like a teenager asking for his allowance. The power, the swagger, the corrosive charm, it was all gone. "Is there something you need?" she asked, keeping her tone professional, distant. I wanted to apologize," he stammered. "For the other night, at the gala. I was a complete ass, out of line, totally." Ilara leaned back in her chair, stunned. In 10 years of marriage and 2 years of divorce, she had never once heard him apologize for anything. He was physically incapable of admitting fault. His ego was a fortress with no doors. "Okay," she said slowly, waiting for the other shoe to drop. "And for other stuff too," he continued, gaining a bit of pathetic momentum. "I was under a lot of stress with the divorce. And work. I said things I didn't mean." A bitter laugh escaped her before she could stop it. "You meant every word, Mark." He fell silent. He had no defense against the simple truth. This wasn't a conversation between equals anymore. The power had shifted so completely, so seismically, that he was left scrabbling for purchase on a sheer cliff face. "Listen," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "This guy you're seeing, Julian Thorne, he's a serious guy, a major player. Does he know about us? About our history?" And there it was, the real reason for his call. Fear. Raw, professional, existential fear. His small tech firm, Innovex Solutions, was exactly the kind of company Thorne Industries acquired and gutted for its intellectual property. Mark Jennings, a senior VP, would be nothing more than a line item on a spreadsheet, easily deleted. He was terrified that Ilara would whisper a word in Julian's ear, recounting a decade of emotional abuse, and that Julian, in an act of chivalry, would crush his career like a gnat. "What Julian does or doesn't know is none of your concern," Ilara said coldly. No, please, Lara, you have to understand," he pleaded, the desperation raw and undisguised. "My whole career is on the line here. My company does business in the same circles. A word from a guy like him could blackball me forever, everything I've worked for." "Everything you've worked for," she thought. "What about what you tried to destroy?" An ugly, tempting thought surfaced. The ultimate revenge. She could, with a single conversation, bring his world crashing down around him. She could make him pay for every sneer, every condescending laugh, every sleepless night she'd spent believing she was worthless. The power was hers. It was a heady, dizzying feeling. But as she looked around her quiet, sunlit office, at the beautiful designs she had created, at the life she had built for herself out of the rubble of their marriage, she realized something profound. She didn't want it. Revenge was Mark's game. It was a game of destruction, of tearing things down. She was a builder. She created things, gardens, beautiful spaces, a new life. To use her newfound position to destroy him would be to drag his darkness into her light. It would be a victory, but it would be a hollow one, leaving her tainted by the very poison she had worked so hard to purge from her system. "You don't have to worry, Mark," she said, and the words were not for him, but for herself. They were a declaration of her own character, her own values. "I'm not going to say anything to Julian about you or your career. My life with him has nothing to do with my life with you." The relief in his exhale was a pathetic, gusting sound. "Oh, God, Lara, thank you. I owe you, I really do. Anything you need, the house, the sale, it's all yours, whatever you want." The groveling was nauseating. He was trying to buy her silence, to turn her act of grace into a transaction, because that was the only language he understood. "I don't want anything from you, Mark," she said, her voice filled with a weariness that went bone deep. "Not anymore. I just want you to leave me alone. For good. Don't call me. Don't text me. Our lawyers can handle the final paperwork on the house. We have nothing left to say to each other." This was her desperate gambit, not to ruin him, but to finally, completely erase him from her life. "Of course," he said quickly, "whatever you want. Done. Goodbye, Mark." She ended the call and blocked his number. She sat there for a long time, the silence of the room pressing in on her. She had been given the ultimate power over the man who had tormented her, and she had chosen not to use it. She had chosen peace over war, grace over vengeance. It didn't feel like a victory. It didn't feel like a defeat. It felt like freedom. The final heavy chain linking her to her past had rusted through and fallen away, not with a triumphant crash, but with a quiet, decisive click. She was untethered. She was her own, and that was a power no amount of money or influence could ever buy. A week later, Ilara received an email from her lawyer. Mark had agreed to all her terms regarding the sale of the house. He had accepted the offer, hired a premium landscaping firm at his own expense to handle the garden redesign, and had instructed his attorney that all future communication was to go through official channels only. It was over. The efficiency and finality of it were staggering. But Ilara knew there was one last thing she had to do, not for him, and not even for her future with Julian. It was for the woman she had been, the one who had cried herself to sleep in that house so many times. She needed to close the door herself, not just have the lawyers lock it behind her. She sent him one last text from her work phone, a number he wouldn't have blocked. "Ilara, I need to pick up the last of my things from the house, the garden statues, Sunday at 2 p.m. Please be there." he replied almost instantly. "Mark, of course, I'll be there." When Sunday arrived, the sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue. Ilara drove her truck into her old neighborhood, a place of manicured lawns and identical, oversized houses. It felt like a foreign country. As she pulled into the driveway of what was once her home, she saw Mark standing on the porch. He looked diminished. He wasn't wearing one of his power suits, but a pair of slacks and a polo shirt that seemed to hang off his frame. He had lost weight, and there were dark circles under his eyes. The confident, arrogant swagger was gone, replaced by a nervous energy, a fidgety uncertainty. "Hi," he said as she got out of the truck. "Mark," she nodded, walking past him toward the backyard gate. "This won't take long." The backyard was already in chaos. The landscaping firm he'd hired had begun their work. Her beautiful wild garden was gone. The coneflowers and black-eyed Susans had been torn out, leaving behind raw, upturned soil. In their place were stark geometric lines drawn with chalk, marking out where rigid boxwood hedges would soon be planted. It was a sterile, soulless design, and it was a perfect metaphor for him. Her statues, a collection of whimsical, moss-covered gargoyles and sprites she'd collected over the years, were huddled together on the patio, looking like displaced refugees. "I can help you load them," he offered, his voice hesitant. "I can manage," she said, easily lifting the first, a heavy stone dragon, and carrying it toward her truck. She worked in silence, moving back and forth, her body strong and capable from her own physical labor. Mark just stood there, watching her, a helpless, awkward spectator in the dismantling of their shared past. When the last statue was loaded, she closed the tailgate with a satisfying thud and turned to face him. "All right, I'm done," she said. "Lara, wait," he said, taking a step toward her. "Can we just talk for a minute?" She leaned against the side of her truck, crossing her arms. She wasn't afraid of him anymore. She felt nothing but a profound, weary pity. "What is there to talk about, Mark?" "I get it now," he said, his eyes pleading. "Okay, I get it. I screwed up, big time. I see you with him, and you look happy. You do, and he's everything. Rich, powerful. I get why you'd choose that." Ilara stared at him, a slow, cold anger building in her chest. Even now, even after everything, he still thought this was about the money. He still thought her happiness was something that had been bestowed upon her by a powerful man. He was utterly, pathologically incapable of seeing her worth as separate from a man's validation. "You really don't get it at all, do you?" she said, her voice quiet, but sharper than a shard of glass. "You think this is about Julian's money? You think I'm happy because my boyfriend is a billionaire?" "Well, yeah," he stammered. "I mean, it doesn't hurt." She shook her head, a sad, final smile touching her lips. "This happiness, Mark, this peace. I built this. I started building it the day I left you, with nothing but a broken heart and a business plan you laughed at. I built it with every garden I designed, every client I earned, every morning I got up and chose to believe in myself when you had taught me to believe in nothing." She took a step closer, and for the first time he was the one who flinched. "Julian didn't rescue me. He didn't come into my life and wave a magic wand. He came into my life and saw the woman I was already becoming. He doesn't love me because he has to fix me. He loves me because I'm not broken." She let the words sink in, watching the confusion and dawning horror on his face, as he began, perhaps for the first time in his life, to understand the true magnitude of what he had lost. It wasn't a meek, dependent woman who had lucked into a fortune. It was a strong, resilient and capable person who he had systematically tried and failed to destroy. "The real joke, Mark, the truly hilarious part of all of this, isn't that my boyfriend is a CEO," she continued, her voice unwavering. "It's that you had a front-row seat to my life for 10 years, and you never saw me at all. You just saw a reflection of your own insecurities, and now you have to live with that. You have to live in a world where you are no longer the most important man in the room. I can't imagine how terrifying that must be for you." He had no answer. His face was a canvas of shame, regret, and a dawning, terrible loneliness. The echo of his own laughter was finally, truly haunting him. He was the wounded bird. He was the reclamation project. And he was utterly, hopelessly alone. "Goodbye, Mark," Ilara said again, the words holding their final definitive weight. She got into her truck, started the engine, and didn't look back. As she drove away from the house for the last time, she felt no anger, no sadness, no lingering sense of loss. She felt only the lightness of leaving a great weight behind. The road ahead was open, bathed in the brilliant cloudless blue of the afternoon sun, and for the first time she was driving toward a future that was entirely, beautifully her own. The statues found a new home scattered throughout Ilara's own garden, their mossy stone faces peeking out from behind ferns and Texas sage. They looked happier here, more at home than they ever had in the sterile perfection of Mark's backyard. The little bungalow, once a temporary refuge, now felt like a permanent sanctuary. That evening, Julian came over. He didn't call first. He just appeared at her door with 2 containers of her favorite Thai food and a bottle of wine. This had become their new normal, an easy, comfortable rhythm that didn't require planning or pretense. He found her on the back porch, sketching in a notebook, the setting sun casting long golden shadows across the lawn. He set the food down and wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder and looking down at the intricate drawing of a perennial border. "It's beautiful," he murmured, his voice a warm rumble against her ear. "It's for the new community center downtown," she said, leaning back into his embrace. "They want something that attracts pollinators." They ate on the porch as twilight bled across the sky, turning the blue to purple and then to a deep, starry indigo. Ilara told him about her final meeting with Mark. She recounted the entire conversation, including Mark's pathetic assumption that her happiness was a byproduct of Julian's wealth. Julian listened patiently, his expression unreadable in the dim light. When she finished, he was silent for a long time, swirling the wine in his glass. "Are you angry?" Ilara asked softly. "Angry?" He looked up, seeming surprised by the question. "No, I'm not angry at him. I pity him. To live in a world so transactional, so utterly devoid of genuine connection. It must be a prison." He reached across the small table and took her hand. "What I am is in awe of you." "Of me? Why?" "Because you had all the power, Ilara," he said, his voice thick with sincerity. "You could have destroyed that man. With what he did to you, no one would have blamed you. You could have asked me to make one phone call and his professional life would have been over. But you didn't. You chose grace. You took the high road when he had spent a decade forcing you into the gutter. That takes a kind of strength that I don't think I would have." Tears welled in Ilara's eyes, blurring the fairy lights she had strung along the porch railing. It was one thing to feel that strength inside herself. It was another to have the person she loved most in the world recognize it and name it. "I did it for me," she whispered. "Not for him. I had to prove to myself that I was better than him, that his cruelty hadn't become my own." "I know," he said, his thumb stroking the back of her hand, "and that's why I love you." The words hung in the warm night air, simple, profound, and utterly true. She had been waiting her whole life to hear them said with such quiet, uncomplicated certainty. "I love you too, Julian," she replied, and the words felt like coming home. They sat in a comfortable silence after that, a different kind of silence from the one she had known before. It wasn't an absence of noise, it was a presence of peace. It was the silence of 2 people who didn't need words to understand each other. It was the silence of a shared future, stretching out before them, full of possibility. Later, as they were washing the dishes together in her small kitchen, Julian paused, a thoughtful expression on his face. "There's something I've been meaning to ask you," he said. "Anything?" "Thorn Industries has a philanthropic wing," he began. "The Thorn Foundation. We fund a lot of environmental and community greening projects, urban farms, park revitalizations, public gardens." He turned to face her, drying his hands on a dish towel. The foundation is looking for a new creative director. Someone with a vision, with a real passion for how green spaces can transform communities. Someone with a brilliant eye for design and a deep understanding of sustainable horticulture. He let the implication hang in the air. Ilara's heart began to beat faster. It wasn't just a job offer, it was a kingdom, a chance to do what she loved on a scale she had never dreamed possible, with resources that could bring her most ambitious designs to life. The old Ilara, the one conditioned by Mark, would have been filled with doubt. "I'm not qualified. It's just a pity offer. I only have a small business." But that Ilara was gone. The woman standing in her place looked at the man she loved and saw not a billionaire offering a handout, but a partner offering an opportunity, one he genuinely believed she had earned. Still, a crucial question remained. "Would I be working for you?" she asked, her voice steady. He shook his head immediately. "No. The foundation has its own board, its own president. You would answer to them. I'm on the board, of course, but I don't get involved in the day-to-day. This would be your ship to steer, your vision." That was the answer she needed to hear. It was a chance to build something even bigger, something that was hers and hers alone. I need to think about it," she said, her mind reeling with the possibilities. "Of course," he said, his smile gentle and understanding. "Take all the time you need. The offer will be there." That night, as she lay in bed, the silence of the house was filled not with echoes of the past, but with the whispers of an extraordinary future. It was a future she had not been given, but had cultivated herself, seed by painstaking seed, until it was ready to bloom. 6 months later, Ilara stood on a patch of barren, dusty land in a neglected corner of East Austin. To her left was a crumbling brick wall covered in graffiti. To her right was the drone of a nearby highway. In front of her was a group of eager neighborhood volunteers, a team of professional landscapers, and a small mountain of compost and mulch. She held up a large blueprint, its pages flapping in the warm autumn breeze. "Okay, everyone," she said, her voice clear and confident, carrying easily over the morning air. "The first phase is soil remediation. We need to clear the debris and start amending the soil with the compost. The Thorn Foundation is committed to using only organic, sustainable methods." She was in her element. As the new creative director of the Thorn Foundation's Green Spaces initiative, she was no longer just designing gardens. She was building ecosystems. She was transforming forgotten urban lots into vibrant community hubs, with vegetable plots for local families, pollinator gardens for bees and butterflies, and shady groves of native trees where children could play. Her own small business was now thriving under the management of a talented young horticulturist she had hired, taking on select residential projects while Ilara focused on the bigger picture. She hadn't been swallowed by Julian's world. She had expanded her own to run parallel to it, each of them with their own passions, their own work, coming together at the end of the day to share in their separate triumphs. Julian was there that morning, dressed in the same faded UT t-shirt and worn jeans he'd worn to work in her own garden. He wasn't there as the CEO of Thorn Industries. He was just another volunteer, his hands already dirty as he helped a group of teenagers haul bags of mulch. He caught her eye across the lot and gave her a wink, his face beaming with a pride that was pure and unconditional. Their love had settled into a beautiful, steady rhythm. It was a love built not on grand gestures or dramatic rescues, but on shared values, mutual respect, and the quiet joy of watching each other shine. Later that afternoon, after the workday was done, Ilara sat on the tailgate of her truck, sipping a bottle of water and watching the sun begin to set, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and pink. The empty lot already looked different, imbued with the energy of hope and hard work. Her phone buzzed. It was an email notification from her lawyer, a simple subject line, "Jennings Property, Sale Finalized." She opened it. The house was officially sold. The funds had been transferred. The last tie was, in the most literal sense, severed. She felt a brief, distant pang of nostalgia, not for the marriage, but for the young woman who had once believed in it so fiercely. She sent a silent wish for her peace, wherever she was now, and then archived the email without a second thought. She had heard through the grapevine that Mark had been moved to a different department at his company after a corporate restructuring. It was a lateral move, a demotion in all but name, pushing him out of the spotlight and into a quiet, irrelevant corner of the org chart. He was no longer a player. He was just a man in a suit, haunted by the ghost of a woman he never knew and a power he could never have. Ilara felt no satisfaction at the news, only a detached sense of an ending. His story was over. Hers was just beginning. Julian came and sat beside her, his arm draping comfortably around her shoulders. He smelled of sweat and soil and sunshine. "Good day," he said, his voice content. "The best," she agreed, leaning her head against his shoulder. They sat in silence, watching the sun dip below the horizon. It was a different kind of silence now, one that held no echoes of the past, no ghosts of laughter meant to harm. It was a silence filled with the promise of 1,000 more sunrises, just like this one, each one a chance to build, to grow, to love. It was the sound of her own life finally, beautifully, in full bloom. Ilara's journey wasn't about revenge. It was about reclaiming her own voice and realizing that her worth was never up for his debate. Her victory wasn't in who she was dating, but in who she had become all on her own. If her story of quiet resilience and unexpected triumph resonated with you, let me know in the comments. What do you think was the most powerful moment in her transformation? Your engagement helps these stories reach more people who might need to hear them. Don't forget to like this video, share it with someone who loves a story of empowerment, and subscribe for more dramatic tales of life, love, and redemption. Click that notification bell so you never miss a chapter of our next story. Thank you for watching.